Okay, so this is going to be a video in response to Paul's video of the day, and also a bit of Grim Grizz live stream. And I'm going to try not to ramble too much, so I wrote down some notes, and basically, I am of the opinion that Dune, especially within the larger series of the books that Frank Herbert wrote, is a very important work of fiction, and it wrestles with a lot of questions that Tolkien didn't feel motivated to answer. And his hatred or whatever of Frank Herbert, I think, is characterized, we can characterize it along religious lines, as kind of the video that Paul was showing did. But I don't think that you should pit Tolkien's Catholicism against Frank Herbert's agnosticism or atheism, as you will. Okay, so the first thing I want to address is what Grimm complained about, and this is an important thing. He's complained about it many times in the first movie. I haven't seen the second movie yet, but in the first one, where Paul faces the Gom Jabbar, and in the new movie it's with his mother's help. It seems to be that the director of the movie has this notion, and I've heard, Damien Walter seems like really gung-ho about this idea, because I guess it plays into some changes he made in the second movie regarding like the character of Chani. That basically it's like, oh, he's telling the story as if somebody has already known all three parts of the movie, whereas, like, if you look at the old one from the 80s, the movie from the 80s, that was like just a telling of the first book, and it's kind of that first act thing of like the hero's journey or whatever. Like, yes, Paul is the hero, he's the Messiah type figure, and obviously he's a good guy, and it's good that he's in charge. So what he wants to do is cast a little bit more, this is what the new director wants to do, is cast a little bit more doubt on the character of Paul. Is he really a Messiah, or is he like some kind of a psychotic, just crazy person, like, or charismatic leader, that gets swept up into a fundamentalist thing or something like that. And he says that was what Frank Herbert wanted to portray, that it was like that he's not the real Messiah, I guess you could say, or the real Kwisatz Haderach. But within the context of the first book, there are certainly signs that he is, and even if he is not, when we say like the Messiah or the ultimate one, that's kind of a misnomer, because there's always a progression of these types of figures, and they are here to accomplish what they do in a time and place. And the expectancy that we have in expecting somebody to always fit within one certain type of Messiah archetype is what leads to the problem of antichrists, because that is when we fall for an antichrist, because they have the appearance that we expect, the trappings of office, the type of personality, and what they portray fits our expectations, which is why we fall for it. But where an antichrist differs from a Christ is in the content of the message that they speak, because an antichrist only tells lies, or essentially tells lies, whereas a true Christ or Christ figure, a true prophet, will speak the truth. So the overarching theme that Denis Villanueva believes that he is pulling out of this story, that he thinks was part of Frank Herbert's central message, is to beware of charismatic leaders. And like, maybe so. I mean, you know, you could say, yeah, how do you beware of charismatic leaders? By using other means to determine if they are trustworthy or not, other than like emotions or whatever, or you question your particular interpretations of prophecy. You know, like, I guess you could say in some sense, and because I can't even remember which of all the videos I'm watching who's kind of making this point or whatever, if it was Paul or if it was Damian Walter, but you know, maybe it was Paul. The idea that, like, oh, these messianic prophetic these prophecies are kind of seeded into the culture, and therefore is to say therefore they are artificial or whatever. Is that the case? I don't think so, because if we look at, you know, and this is me being fundamentalist or whatever, but like, let's say that the various things like the flood and the Tower of Babel story are real, and then like the story of Joseph you know, dispersing grain and people from all nations coming to that place, and then you can take the other things too, the Exodus and then the later diaspora out of the kingdom. You know, there's always these, like, God speaking a certain kernel of truth, you know, like what was brought on the ark, that version of the kind of mythology of creation spreads everywhere. And then when people are dispersed in like a Tower of Babel, some people have more of the story, others have less. They maybe use their imagination to expand it. They incorporate things that happen within their own culture, because it's ridiculous to think like God was speaking to the Israelites and nothing else was happening in the rest of the world. You know, like, there are stories of miraculous interventions all over, and so, you know, we got to assume those are ways in which God is speaking. You know, because if you look at something like Zoroastrianism, it's basically a form of monotheism. You know, there's some issues of disagreement with like traditional Abrahamic religion, but in general, I would say, yes, they came to the correct conclusion about the nature of God as the one God versus common notions of paganism and polytheism. That's the word. So you know, like, that is the way that prophecy spread, is through this natural seeding. And so to say like, oh, it's not true because it wasn't just like a divine work, it's like that's creating this fallacy that we think like that the world is all natural. You know, it's the natural and supernatural problem. Like God has no control over the natural way things happen, and he only interacts in the supernatural. No, that's not right. So he does these things through people. So I don't think that that's an issue that points to Paul being fake, or even that you know, that like these prophecies we're supposed to think they're fake. Because what do we see when we open Scripture? We see types of Christ. We see Christ figures all throughout. Abel, Enoch, Adam, you know, Adam, Abel, Enoch, Noah, and also even I would say people like Cain, you know, Jacob is but also Esau. In their antagonism, we see the both andness. Both, you know, because really every person is the part of the image of God. We all reflect the image of God in different ways. And so none of those are perfect people, but some of them were very great messianic figures within their time and place. So what you see is this progression of imperfect representations of the perfect. And then from Christian standpoint, we say then Jesus. And then on the other side of Jesus, you see the same exact thing, except now it is that, you see it in the lives of saints. And as the church grows and the influence of Christianity spreads, but societies apostatize. And I think sometimes even, yes, the messianic figure and the prophetic figure can be the person who is outside of the Orthodox community, like certainly that would be the way that in hindsight you would have to look at somebody like Jan Hus, who kind of came, or like even, like maybe like Martin Luther or something like that, to say, oh, from the Catholic standpoint, they are outside, and so therefore they must be an antichrist and not a Christ. But over the centuries, wasn't their message the true message that was accepted, or at least parts of it? And that's always the case, Nobody except for Jesus has everything that they do absolutely perfect or whatever. So, but by looking across that broad spectrum of examples, we can figure out the direction that God wants us to go. And then, so then you can project that into this thing where we are always writing these novels and these books with these characters who are not perfect, but it's giving us this imagination of like, what would a messianic figure look like in this scenario? And then of course what we're supposed to glean from that is like, what could I be called to do in my current time and place that would bring about that kind of change? And so like, as far as like Paul being the real guy or whatever, he's it's like he doesn't pass the test, the water of life, the way that a woman normally does. It's kind of this like, he kind of does it on like a technicality. It's like he has like one drop, but he survives, and then it does the thing where it like unlocks his ancestral memories. And because he's a male, he can see the male and the female, which is this really interesting thing going on there that, kind of harkens back to Adam, Eve being created out of Adam, that the male has access to the male and the female, whereas the female only has access to female memories. Like if it was like a sex chromosome coded thing, that would actually make sense. That's just, side note, just thought of. But so you are supposed to question, like, to what degree are we supposed to like view Paul, and he's wrestling with it himself. Because okay, so here's the thing, and this is why I'd say Tolkien's religion comes in contrast with Frank Herbert's religion. Not thinking Frank Herbert is atheist or agnostic, because really he's much more closer to a Calvinist or a hyper-Calvinist, because, or maybe an Arminian in a way, because what he's really wrestling with is this idea of determinism. And there is an interview with him where he talks about, like, just even the way that we say the future. When we say the future, we're saying like a singular future. That future already exists, it's already determined, and it's simply unfolding. And in that sense, it's, well, what power do we even have? What choices do we even have? And this is what he wrestles with in the story. And I think that Tolkien's, Catholicism, his love of hierarchy and all that is provided to him through that system, Tolkien does not ever have to be the person that wrestles with the hard questions of, like, what do you do if you are the one responsible for the decisions? Because he loves the hierarchy. He it's, you just do you. and which is why his dream is just to be in charge of the garden. Sam back in the Shire just tending the vegetables. That's the thing. Oh no, like everything is wrong because Sam had to leave the garden, and because the hierarchy was messed up. In paradise, Sam never has to leave the garden because everything outside of the garden is taken care of by somebody other than Sam. And it's like the same thing. Tolkien's in World War One, but did he ever have to consider what it was like to be in Churchill's shoes, to actually have to make choices and thinking it comes down to one person making a choice and determining the outcome for thousands and millions of others? Probably not. And certainly would never think about like what should the Pope do? Like what would I do if I was Pope? Like is that something he would think of as a Catholic? Probably not, because it's not in his role to be Pope. And he probably didn't even spend much time speculating about what the local priest or bishop should or should not do, or what he would do if he was in their position. So I think that his love of hierarchy and seeing this like desire for like this ordered world kept him from wrestling with the difficult questions that Herbert deals with, because ultimately, the thing that we all sort of deal with in deterministic systems or whatever, and obviously it's not just Christians. All Christians, if you believe the Bible is true, you have to deal with the determinism to the level of, is the book of Revelation true? And if so, it will happen, and that's one future. There is one future that will ultimately happen. There's a lot more mystery about what happens in between here and there, and what effect our choices have. But he's always wrestling with this question of, the sovereignty of God, ultimately, the determined nature of the future, and our personal responsibility. And so somebody like Paul, with what he has, which is some sort of not a perfect knowledge of the future, but a powerful sense of prescience, trying to figure out what the best thing to do is. And he becomes a religious fanatic because he sees that, because in the book you see it over and over again, he's wrestling with these different things, different outcomes, and what he realizes is that this sort of religious path that he can take, he can willingly accept this role. It was, as far as he could tell, the best outcome, because the Fremen army that he creates basically goes and gets rid of all the imperial power, the Sardaukar. They are targeting all the military power and replacing all the military power in the universe. But by doing that, what they're doing is preserving the civilian populations of all of the galaxy or whatever, all the planets everywhere. And so he sees this as his like jihad or whatever. He's seeing different things. He's seeing like one thing is like just a vacuum of leadership creating galaxy-wide war, and then he and of all, or of various different catastrophes, and he determines that the best path is this one, where he basically sacrificially takes on this role, and he symbolically marries the emperor's daughter and all this stuff to basically take control and use his knowledge, his foreknowledge, to prevent a much greater war from happening. That is why he does what he does. And it's not given to us as like, and it is given to us of the sense of he can see the future, which is not really an uncommon thing, because it's the same thing that the navigators that fly the spaceships or whatever, that's the same thing they do. They see into the future using the spice. And but he uses that knowledge in the future to preserve as much life as he can and do the best thing he can. So that is the question that Frank Herbert's dealing with. And then he basically will take these giant leaps forward where it's like, okay, well, like, what if then this ability to see the future becomes common amongst humanity? Let's go another 3,000 years in the future and see what the world is like then. And that's when you get to like the fourth book of the series, which is the key, I think, to understanding the whole thing, and a really powerful book where Paul's son has been reigning as emperor, and he's this weird like creature, this like sandworm man hybrid, and he's been ruling as emperor for like 3,500 years. And he basically, what he's doing is making himself the bad guy for humanity in order to essentially free them or give them a free choice. He's taking control over everything and like basically becoming the big cosmic bad guy, and then ultimately lets himself be killed, gives up his existence once somebody else arises who is immune from being seen through foreknowledge given by the spice or prescience or whatever. So, and I think that the really interesting observation that I made was to look at these two different characters of Paul and his son Leto, and they map very closely, I think, onto the lives and especially the political rule of King David and King Solomon. Because, you know, King David, like Paul, unifies the nation. He's got a lot of drama going on, is a charismatic leader, is a great warrior, but not perfect. And, you know, he is more of a military figure. Whereas Solomon, with his great wisdom, takes control of the economic powers and the political powers and creates this kingdom. And the interesting thing is that looking back on the story of Solomon after reading Frank Herbert's book, it seems very clear that what Solomon was doing was very similar to what Leto II is doing, where he's bringing the kingdom to the very pinnacle of success that it can possibly reach, centered, you know, around those areas of power, economic power, political power, you know, and he does it the same way that Solomon does. Solomon has great wisdom, which is the closest analog to prescience, knowing the future. And it's like, and it's really interesting because, you know, I thought about this in regards to, like, everybody talks about the, you know, when you read the Bible and it talks about the wisdom of Solomon, the story that it tells you is this one where he's deciding on the fate of this baby, you know, between these two prostitutes. And one's baby's dead, and they're fighting over who's the other baby belongs to. And of course, he devises this scheme where he says, "Bring me a sword, and I'm going to cut the baby in half." And the woman whose son died, who stole the baby, is like, "Yes, let's do it. That's fair." And then the other woman, who is the real mother, is saying, "No, give it to her. She can have the baby because she doesn't want her child to actually die." And Solomon says, "This is the mother. Give it to her." And we think like, "Oh yeah, wow, that's like such a great, clever thing that he did." But that is a absolutely terrifying thing to make, decision to make. And there are a lot of people who, you know, like, we kind of read that story and say like, oh, it's because of the mother's natural instinct toward her child that, you know, well, he had to actually be able to tell beforehand that at least one of those women was the kind of mother that had that natural instinct for the child, and that that woman was the one whose child it actually was, and that the other woman was not that kind of person. And to assume that a mother would not harm her child in that time makes no sense at all, because what was very common sin that the Israelites kept falling into was child sacrifice. And obviously, you know, the thing that was most practiced then, they didn't really do abortion, they just did exposure. So if you didn't want a baby, just for the inconvenience sake, which is probably pretty typical for prostitutes, they would just put the baby outside and just ignore it until it died, or somebody took it, or whatever. So, like, in reality, when he made that decision, there is, you know, if somebody else did that and they didn't actually possess the wisdom that Solomon had, there is a high chance that he could have ended up cutting a baby in half, like, because if they called his bluff. Which then you think, well, why not just orchestrate a situation where a political rival could do that? You know, and if you think about it, actually, when you look at, like, David's life, Nathan comes up to him, tells him the parable of the sheep. And then, whatever it is, a few chapters later, when he's getting into disputes with Absalom or whatever, I should have looked it up. But, you know, then there's this wise woman, I think it's the wise woman of Tekoa or whatever, who they basically say, like, okay, here you go, do this and do this thing. And basically what they figured out is, like, oh, David is a sucker for these parables. If you do a parable with a moral feel-good thing, it's going to stir his heartstrings and his emotions, and he's going to go easy on you. And so it's like they pegged him and they gamed the system, and they gave him exactly what they were expecting. So it would have been just as easily if someone, you know, if someone knew what they were doing, to say, let's set up a scenario where we put the king in this position to choose between two women, you know, with this baby. And what we're going to do is we're going to set him up, because the women are in on it, and it's to take him down. And what we're going to do is we're going to make this king kill a baby, and that will ruin his reign as king. You know, like, he could have been taken in with that scheme. Like, I think we don't even, like, really consider that story closely enough, with as far as, like, what he was doing and how kind of ballsy it was, really. So anyway, so to go back to the whole comparison between King Solomon and God Emperor of Dune for Leto II, I think what Solomon did with his kingdom, which is what Leto did, is he brought it to a brink, a pinnacle of success that was so precarious that by his wisdom he could maintain the status quo. But it required all the wisdom that he actually had. And if he's replaced with somebody, a new king who does not have the same level of wisdom, they will fail, and the kingdom will fracture. And so obviously that is what happens in the case of Solomon, and it's what happens in the case of Leto II as well. You know, it's kind of interesting too. It's the same thing that happened with Mark Driscoll's church. You know, they confronted him on his thing. He said, "I'm quitting," and then the church they hadn't thought about how much he was the one actually holding things together. There was no infrastructure without him as a person at the head. It instantly dissolved, and that's what, you know. And I think so. I think what Leto obviously does, as it's told in the story, is he's set things up in this way, because what he wants is for humanity to disperse and to scatter and spread out. You know, the thing that God keeps telling people to do in the early parts of Genesis. To go spread out, fill the place, become diverse, become adaptive to different environments, because that is how you thrive. So so that's what Leto does, and that I think that's what Solomon does too. So I think that Solomon would not have been shocked at all. I think he was planning on the kingdom splitting when Rehoboam took over. And probably, if you think about, like, Solomon, what he did with his own choices, dabbling in things that were not wise. He's the wisest man, but he does all this stuff that's not wise. It's the thing of, like, I'm smart enough to break the rules, but you're not. Because the book, because the wisdom that he writes for his son is the book of Proverbs, which is the most clear-cut, stay on the middle road, don't go off in the weeds kind of book of wisdom. But see, the thing what Solomon did is said the weeds isn't a death sentence. If you're really smart, you can get out of the weeds. But you know what's better? Stay on the path. And so what I think that he actually did, in a sense, was create a situation where once things cracked, now Rehoboam is in a much lower pressure situation, because he doesn't have to maintain this pinnacle of wealth and this, because and ultimately that wealth created a situation where other nations wanted to come and take that wealth, and so, like, the Egyptians come or whatever, they take the gold from the temple, it's replaced with bronze, and then they're okay, then they're safe. Like, it's like, okay, Solomon essentially created a situation where then a foreign power was able to take the wealth out without destroying the kingdom. And so then he gave his son the Shire. He gave his son the garden that he could tend and not have to worry about all the, being the smartest guy in the whole world and, everything that comes along with that. So, so that, I think, is a really important thing you can get from this story, and then seeing how that plays out in other things. And in essence, Frank Herbert really deals a lot more with meta-narrative and seeing a big picture rather than just what's going on with the main characters. Because it's even to say, he doesn't care, we don't find out, because then after what happens after book 4, it's another 1,500 years in the future. So every character is dead, except for certain ones they keep bringing back from the dead. But essentially, every character is dead. The character is humanity itself, and what happens as a result of choices that powerful people in charge make on the whole of humanity. So that's the kind of story that he's dealing with. And I think it's interesting then in the next book number 5, the second to last book that he wrote. Even the central character of the planet, which has been the central thing, Arrakis, Dune, is eliminated as a character when the planet is destroyed at the end of the book, because it's not about the world either. It's about humanity as a whole. It's about people and us struggling with our future and our destiny, and what we might do if we end up being in charge of some small sliver of what will become the future. So even that makes me think of the, when Jesus said, what profit, a man to gain the whole world if he loses his soul? And that's the thing, where it's like, yes, he cared about the ecology and all this stuff, but then eventually he says, okay, let's get beyond that. Spice, let's pretend that's not an issue anymore. Sandworms, not an issue anymore. Knowing the future, not an issue anymore. And then, like, the planet, this planet that everybody just has wanted to fight over historically, not an issue anymore. Destroy it. Get rid of it all to see, like, and then what? And then what? And that's where I think it's just a fascinating series, because he did more questioning and then what than definitely Tolkien ever did, but more than almost any other author does. Because most science fiction writers, their work becomes dated so quickly, and there's really only a little bit of that in Frank Herbert, because I think the one area that would be different now if he wrote it is with the Bene Gesserits, and their ability to control the chemical creations of their bodies or whatever. Basically, having all the control over their organs and being able to transform poison within their body. I think that would be changed by the way that we now understand microbiomes, and that there would be probably sentient communication between microbiotic systems within. That's just a thing that I thought of. That's the only thing that I think from like a scientific point of view that would change, because he really went beyond all of the like sciencey stuff. It's like, basically he thought of like, take every other science fiction story, Terminator with the AI that's going to take over the world, and he says, okay, well, what if it takes over the world and everything goes as bad as possible, and then what's the remaining surviving part of humanity going to do? And that was the question that he was interested in. So he's always interested in what happens after the story that everybody else always wants to tell is done. What happens next? And Tolkien just saw that as like time for gardening. So I think that that's an unsatisfactory. I mean, it's satisfactory for the person in the moment, having the feel goods, but it's not helpful for the humanity in the future. I feel like I had one more thing I was going to say to kind of wrap this up. I don't know, this is pretty long, pretty rambly, but hopefully it's entertaining to someone or helps contribute to the conversation. So thank you for listening. Read the Dune books, wrestle with them, think about them in relation to the Bible, in relation to Christ figures, and our responsibility. Oh yeah, I guess I was going to say AI. AI is like the thing now that I think that Dune will help us kind of deal with, because the question is, okay, if people can take this drug and be able to see the future, or if certain people can, how is the rest of the world supposed to cope with that? And that's the question that we have to wrestle with in regards to like AI, surveillance technology, just, all this crazy data. Like, some people will be able to know the future in a sense, or they will have very strong and convincing messages that they're going to share with everybody about what the future is going to be, and that is something that we're going to have to wrestle with. And so I think that reading books where people have wrestled with these ideas and sometimes gone the bad way because of it, but the arguments have been followed to their logical conclusions, I think is a really helpful thing. And so I think that's one of the areas that these books could really help us with in the future. And I think that Tolkien's response to only those things is kind of this thing that you see where it's he would just be the one that would say, this is a fad and it'll go away, or it's not going to amount to anything, and so you just listen to like John Vervaeke and stuff, and you can see he's very worried about people that are dismissive in that way, and I think that he's right. I don't think that it's going to be the end of humanity, but it could be the end of a lot of people's humanity if we don't think about it. So think about what you would have to do to be one of the people that survives, I guess. All right. Thank you for listening. Leave comments.